Now, you need to pay attention now, okay, as we move into our next story. Here we go. Now, after you get through and buy tickets to go and see Blondie's Debbie Harry at the Cheltenham Literature Festival, you then spend the next few months of seeing her, of meeting her, of hearing from her. However, somehow, one way or another, it doesn't end well. I'm afraid it's fair to say that the Debbie Harry event wasn't well received at the Literature Festival, with social media reviews more tragic than atomic.
Interviewer asked obscure questions of little interest to festival audience. Debbie and Chris seemed disengaged.
I had this misfortune to see Debbie Harry and Chris Stein at the Cheltenham Literature Festival last night. Should have been brilliant, but the interviewer Rob Roth, who helped Debbie write the book, was dreadful.
Just been to see Debbie Harry at the Cheltenham Literature Festival. Very disappointing, embarrassing lack of preparation and poor delivery. Unstructured, uninformative and not very entertaining. People left after a few minutes. Wish we had.
Fantastic festival, but what the hell was that Debbie Harry debacle? Walked out with loads of others. Worst ever. Disgrace.
Debbie Harry interview was appalling. The interviewer was possibly the worst I've ever seen. Lazy and unplanned, no structure, and just not in tune with the audience whatsoever. So many people left.
The worst Cheltenham Literature Festival event I've ever been to in over 20 years of attending.
Oh, brutal. So, do those people have a point? Or just a... Well, we approached the Cheltenham Literature Festival today, but they didn't want to comment. But BBC Radio Gloucestershire's Rachel Clapton is a big Blondie fan, and she herself was in the audience last night as our...
I do agree with a lot of what they say. Rob Roth, who was doing the interview of Debbie Harry and Chris Stein from Blondie, he was their artistic director for their concerts, and the backstory is with him. He was obviously heard their anecdotal stories of their life touring or life in Blondie. Thinks this is great, let's commit it to a book. Debbie Harry says, great, I've got some photos that can do it, and then we could go with that and we can make this book. Hence, you have the book, Face It. He was brought on to interview Debbie and Chris. Really, it was more of an kind of in jokes. It was kind of like a stream of consciousness, his questions. They didn't exactly lead anywhere. Whereas you probably would have a journalist or somebody of a journalistic background that would add a question that would lead to another question, and indeed open questions. There wasn't anything like that. So he'd go from one point to another, but we weren't really finding out much about the history of Blondie, the stories, albums, anything like that we weren't getting.
Because some of her stories have been put in the papers as part of the serialisation of the book. There's some really juicy stuff in there. So did you hear any of that?
Absolutely nothing. And you can imagine it, Steve. So you bought your ticket and you're thinking, this is going to be a good night. We're going to find some things out.
Yeah.
And we just didn't. He just didn't ask those questions. And that's what we were there for. We wanted to know all about it all. We wanted to know about the background. Nothing.
And we're hearing there from the reviews, I walked out. I saw people walking out, and I wish I had. There were people literally leaving the room.
There were people leaving the room. About halfway through, people started leaving. I thought, personally, a little bit disrespectful, in so much as it is Cheltenham Literature Festival. We've got a big name like Debbie Harry and Chris Stein. We're lucky to have these people come to the festival, but I can understand why people would. I sat to the end because when the questions were put out to the audience for the Q&A, the real fans asking the questions, then you got the juicy tidbits.
So actually those that walked out denied themselves the best bit, which was when actually the microphone hit the floor.
Yeah.
And then you got to hear about the real stories of Debbie Harry.
That's when it was sort of coming about. You heard about Joey Ramone, you heard about their time on Top of the Pops, them touring, some little juicy tidbits from that. You got those stories. If, in hindsight, the Q&A was started right from the very beginning, the real fans would have got the information that they wanted about the music, about the gigs that they'd been to, that kind of thing. It would have worked so much more. It's also worth saying as well that I think there is an argument also that a lot of people were leaving early. That was one reason, because the interview wasn't probably up to scratch, shall we say. But I think a lot of people were leaving early just so they could get ahead of the queue to get the book signed by Debbie and Chris afterwards, which I thought was a little off as well.
Or they thought, I'm not enjoying this, but at least I'm going to get my book signed.
That is a very strong point, yes.
Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rachel Clapton, big Blondie fan. She was in the audience last night. She sat through it, even the bits which weren't good. And it seems that everybody's saying the similar thing, that the guy interviewing them was just too close to Blondie, didn't ask very good questions, wasn't a great interviewer. And that's where the blame lay. As I said, we have approached the Cheltenham Literature Festival. They didn't want to comment this evening.